The town of Ashvale had always been cloaked in a peculiar kind of silence. Nestled between dense forests and rolling hills, its cobblestone streets and ivy-covered buildings gave it the appearance of a storybook village. But beneath the charm, the town held secrets whispered in the dark, carried by the wind through the creaking branches of the ancient oaks. At the heart of the town's recent unease was the sudden death of William Renshaw, a man whose wealth and power loomed over Ashvale like a storm cloud. William had built his fortune as a land baron, buying out struggling farmers and turning their fields into sprawling estates. To some, he was a visionary, to others, he was a tyrant. But no one could deny his influence. The details of his death were murky at best. Some claimed he had suffered a heart attack while riding his prized black stallion, Midnight, on the outskirts of town. Others whispered of foul play, of debts and enemies catching up to him. The fact that Midnight had vanished on the same night only added to the speculation. Elizabeth Renshaw stood at the edge of the open meadow, her black dress blending into the shadows of the encroaching trees. The heavy veil covering her face did little to hide her trembling frame. To the townsfolk, she was the picture of a grieving widow. But those who knew her better saw something else in her posture, an unease, as though she feared something lurking just beyond the veil of mist. Elizabeth and William's marriage had been a spectacle from the start. She was the young, beautiful daughter of a farmer who had sold his land to William, only to see it turned into a luxurious estate. William had courted her aggressively, promising her family security in exchange for her hand. Over the years, their union became less of a partnership and more of a business arrangement. Elizabeth had learned to endure his temper, his secrets, and the cold, empty halls of their mansion. As she stood by the coffin, clutching a single white rose, her thoughts were a whirlwind. Did she mourn the man she had married, or the life she might have had without him? The answer remained elusive, even to herself. The funeral had drawn a larger crowd than Elizabeth had anticipated. Farmers in worn boots stood alongside polished city men, their faces a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. Some came out of respect, others to confirm for themselves that William Renshaw was truly dead. The pastor's voice echoed through the clearing as he began the eulogy. Today, we lay to rest a man who left an indelible mark on Ashvale, a man of ambition, of vision. Elizabeth tuned out the words, her eyes drifting over the crowd. She caught glimpses of familiar faces: Thomas Barlow, the farmer who had once begged William not to take his land; Clara Jenkins, the town's gossip who thrived on the misery of others; and then, near the back, a figure she didn't recognize. Tall, cloaked in a dark coat, the figure stood perfectly still, their face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. As the pastor's words continued, a distant sound began to rise above the murmur of the wind. It was faint at first, a rhythmic drumming that grew louder with each passing second. Heads turned toward the crest of the hill, where the sound seemed to originate. And then, there he was, Midnight, William's infamous stallion, appeared like an apparition against the gray sky. His coat glistened with sweat, his mane wild and tangled. He moved with a fury that seemed almost otherworldly, his hooves striking the ground like thunderclaps. The crowd gasped as the massive horse charged down the hill, straight toward the funeral. Midnight, someone muttered, disbelief evident in their tone. The stallion barreled through the crowd, scattering mourners in his wake. Elizabeth froze, her breath catching in her throat as the horse veered toward the coffin. For a brief moment, Midnight locked eyes with her, and in that instant, she felt something she couldn't explain: fear, recognition, and a chilling sense of inevitability. The coffin cracked beneath the force of Midnight's hooves. The sound of splintering wood cut through the air like a scream, silencing the crowd. And then came the cries. At first, they were faint, almost indistinguishable from the rustling leaves. But as the mourners strained to listen, the cries grew louder, unmistakably human. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they realized the sound was coming from within the shattered coffin. Elizabeth stumbled back, her vision swimming. The cries echoed in her ears, pulling her into memories she had tried desperately to bury. She remembered the nights William would disappear into the woods, returning hours later with mud, streaked boots, and a look of quiet satisfaction. She remembered the locked doors in the mansion, the hushed voices behind them. And she remembered the last words he had said to her before his death. Some secrets are best left buried. Her legs felt like lead as she moved toward the coffin, driven by a mixture of dread and compulsion. The cries continued, muffled but persistent, like a newborn wailing for its mother. "Stop," the pastor shouted, his voice shaking. This must be some kind of trick. But Elizabeth knew better. She dropped the rose she had been holding and reached for the splintered wood, her fingers trembling as she pried the lid open further. What she saw inside made her scream. Inside the coffin lay not just William's lifeless body, but something else, something wrapped in a tattered cloth, small and wraithing. The cries were louder now, almost deafening. Elizabeth's hands flew to her mouth as the cloth shifted, revealing a tiny face, pale and fragile. "It's a baby," someone whispered, their voice tinged with horror. But it wasn't just the presence of the infant that sent waves of terror through the crowd. The child's eyes were wide open, their irises a deep, unnatural shade of crimson. The cries seemed to carry an unearthly resonance, reverberating in the bones of everyone present. Elizabeth's mind raced. How could this be possible? Was it William's child? Whose hands had placed it in the coffin? And why had midnight returned at this precise moment, as if guided by some unseen force? As the chaos unfolded, Elizabeth's eyes darted toward the figure in the dark coat. They hadn't moved since the horse's arrival, standing eerily still at the edge of the clearing. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw their lips curl into a faint smile. "Who are you?" She wanted to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The figure turned abruptly, disappearing into the forest without a trace. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she realized that whoever they were, they had been watching her, waiting for this exact moment. Elizabeth's scream tore through the air, snapping the mourners from their collective stupor. Chaos erupted as some rushed forward to see the coffin's contents, while others stumbled back in horror, shielding their children's eyes. Midnight stood over the splintered wood, snorting and pawing at the ground as if guarding the scene. The baby's cries grew louder, each wail slicing through Elizabeth's mind like a blade. Her hands trembled as she reached for the tiny, writhing form. The child's pale skin felt ice, cold beneath her fingertips, but its heartbeat was strong. A frantic rhythm that contradicted the lifeless shell of William lying just inches away. "What in God's name is that?" a voice demanded. It was Thomas Barlow, his weathered face twisted in both fear and disgust. "A baby, in the coffin of a dead man." "I don't know," Elizabeth stammered, her voice trembling. She looked up, her veil slipping from her face to reveal wide, tear-filled eyes. "I didn't know, I swear." Her words felt hollow even as she said them. Memories surged to the surface: William's late-night rides, the locked study, and the strange, muffled sounds she sometimes heard echoing through the mansion. She had dismissed them all, convincing herself that they were figments of her imagination or the byproducts of her husband's secretive dealings. But now, confronted with the impossible, she realized the truth had been there all along, just beyond her reach. The pastor stepped forward, his trembling hands clutching the edges of his Bible. His face was ashen, and his eyes darted nervously between the child and the crowd. This is an abomination," he stuttered. "We must stop this madness. This cannot be allowed to continue." "Stop what, exactly?" Elizabeth snapped, her voice rising as anger overtook her fear. "A baby, An innocent child. What do you mean by this? The pastor faltered, his lips forming silent prayers. The crowd murmured in agreement, but their faces betrayed uncertainty. Some looked at Elizabeth with pity, others with suspicion. Whispers of curses and unnatural forces rippled through the air. Enough, Elizabeth shouted, her voice cracking. She cradled the infant against her chest, shielding it from their prying eyes. If any of you have answers, then speak now. But if all you have are accusations, keep them to yourselves. The figure in the dark coat was gone, but their presence lingered like a shadow over the gathering. Elizabeth's gaze darted back toward the tree line, where they had vanished, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve. Whoever they were, they knew something, perhaps everything, about the events that had unfolded. The baby stirred in her arms, its cries softening to whimpers. She looked down and felt a pang of unexpected emotion. Despite the bizarre circumstances, the child's vulnerability struck her. Its crimson eyes no longer seemed menacing, but rather pleading, as though it recognized her as its only hope. Back at the Renshaw estate, Elizabeth stood in the grand hall, the baby still clutched to her chest. The mansion's vast, empty rooms had never felt more oppressive. She avoided the study, the room William had always kept locked. Even now, with him gone, she couldn't bring herself to face whatever secrets it held. The housekeeper, an elderly woman named Agnes, appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. "Mom." She began hesitantly, her voice trembling. What should we do with the child?" Elizabeth hesitated. "We care for it," she said firmly. "It's a baby, Agnes. Whatever happened, it doesn't deserve to suffer, da." Agnes nodded but didn't look convinced. "Mom, there's something you should know." She hesitated. "I've seen that child before." Elizabeth's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Agnes glanced toward the study, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A few months ago, I heard strange sounds coming from Mr. Renshaw's study. Crying, just like that. I thought it was the wind or maybe my mind playing tricks. But now, the implication hung heavy in the air." Elizabeth's stomach churned. Had William known about the child? Had he hidden it away in the very house they shared? And if so, why? Later that evening, Elizabeth worked up the courage to enter William's study. The room was musty and dark, the heavy drapes drawn tight. Dust coated the desk and bookshelves, as though no one had entered in weeks. Yet, something about the space felt alive, as if it had been waiting for her. She rifled through the drawers, her hands trembling as she uncovered documents, ledgers and letters. Most were mundane, business dealings, receipts. But one envelope caught her eye. It was sealed with red wax, the initials WR stamped into it. Breaking the seal, she unfolded the letter with shaking hands. The handwriting was William's, unmistakable in its sharp, angular style. "Elizabeth, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth. Or at least part of it. I never intended for things to end this way. There are forces at play far beyond our understanding, and I have been a pawn in their game for longer than I care to admit. The child of it is not what it seems. Protect it if you can, but beware those who will come for it. They will not stop. They will not relent. The sins of the father will not go unpunished." The letter ended abruptly, the ink smudged as though William had been interrupted. Elizabeth stared at the words, her mind racing. What had William gotten himself into? What had he brought into their lives? As Elizabeth stepped out of the study, the air in the mansion felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. She moved to the nursery, where Agnes had reluctantly prepared a cradle for the baby. The child lay sleeping, its small chest rising and falling with each breath. A soft knock echoed through the halls. Elizabeth's breath caught. No one ever came to the mansion uninvited, especially not at night. She hesitated before making her way to the grand front doors. Pulling them open, she found no one. Only the chilling wind and the endless dark. But as she stepped back, she noticed something on the doorstep, a single black feather, glossy and sharp. Her pulse quickened. Whoever had been there wasn't just watching, they were leaving messages. And Elizabeth feared she was running out of time to understand them. The mansion was silent except for the soft crackling of the fire in the study. Elizabeth sat in the high, back chair, William's letter clutched in her trembling hands. The baby lay in a cradle beside her, its cries now replaced by rhythmic breaths. But even in sleep, the child's tiny chest rose and fell with an unsettling intensity, as though it carried more than just life. Something ancient, something powerful. Elizabeth's eyes scanned the letter for the 100th time. The cryptic words burned into her memory. There are forces at play far beyond our understanding. Protect it if you can, but beware those who will come for it. The words didn't just haunt her, they terrified her. What had William known? What had he done? Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, hooves, faint but deliberate, striking the cobblestone path outside. Midnight. Elizabeth rushed to the window, pulling aside the heavy velvet curtain. There he was, the massive black stallion standing motionless in the courtyard, his mane glistening in the moonlight. His eyes, dark and piercing, seemed to lock onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, she felt as though the horse was trying to communicate something. A knock echoed through the mansion, sharp and insistent. Elizabeth's heart leapt into her throat. She glanced at the cradle, then toward the front door. Her instincts screamed at her to stay put, but she couldn't ignore the pull of curiosity. She grabbed a candle from the table, its flickering flame her only source of light, and made her way down the grand staircase. When she opened the door, a chill wind swept into the mansion, snuffing out her candle. Standing on the doorstep was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in a dark coat. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, but his presence radiated an unsettling familiarity. "Mrs. Renshaw," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "My name is Gideon Graves. I was a colleague of your late husband." Elizabeth's grip tightened on the doorframe. "Colleague? William never mentioned you." "That doesn't surprise me," Gideon replied, stepping into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "Your husband and I shared a very specific kind of partnership, one that required discretion." Elizabeth shut the door, her unease growing. What kind of partnership?" Gideon's eyes flicked toward the staircase, where the faint sound of the baby's breathing carried through the halls. "I think you already know." The words sent a chill down Elizabeth's spine. She positioned herself between Gideon and the stairs. "If you've come for the child, you won't get it." Gideon raised his hands in mock surrender. "I'm not here to take the child. Not yet, anyway. I'm here to warn you. William may have been reckless, but he wasn't a fool. He knew what he was dealing with. Do you?" Elizabeth's voice wavered. "What are you talking about?" Gideon's expression darkened. "That child isn't just an innocent. It's a key, a bridge to something beyond our world. William made a pact, and now the debt has come due." Elizabeth's knees nearly buckled. She gripped the banister for support, her mind racing. What kind of pact? Gideon stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Power, wealth. Everything your husband built was made possible because of that pact. But the cost was always going to be steep." After Gideon left, Elizabeth locked every door and window in the mansion. The baby stirred in its cradle, its cries returning with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She lifted the child, cradling it against her chest, and found herself whispering reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. With trembling hands, she returned to the study. If there were answers, they would be here. She pulled open the bottom drawer of William's desk, one she had always avoided. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with William's initials. She flipped it open, her eyes scanning the pages filled with William's neat, meticulous handwriting. At first, the entries seemed mundane. Business dealings, notes about land acquisitions. But as she read further, the tone shifted. The writing became erratic, the ink smudged and rushed. He wrote of rituals, of ancient texts, of whispered promises made in the dead of night. Midnight stands at the threshold. One entry read, "They say the horse is a harbinger, a guide. If he accepts the offering, the pact is sealed." Elizabeth's hands shook as she turned the page. The next entry was dated just 2 weeks before William's death. "It is done. The child has been claimed. Midnight carried him to the gate, and the pact was fulfilled. But the whispers grow louder. They tell me the cost is not yet paid in full. They say the debt is greater than one life. I fear what I have unleashed." Elizabeth closed the journal, her heart pounding in her chest. Midnight, the horse she had thought of as just a prized possession, was something far more. A harbinger, a guide, and the child. Claimed by whom? For what purpose? The baby's wails grew louder, piercing the stillness of the mansion. Elizabeth rushed back to the nursery, clutching the child to her chest. Its crimson eyes stared up at her, wide and unblinking. The cries carried a strange, otherworldly resonance, as though they weren't just sounds but something alive, something reaching. "Isha," Elizabeth whispered, though her voice trembled. "It's okay. You're safe here." But was it? She glanced toward the window, where the dark forest loomed in the distance. The figure she had seen at the funeral, were they watching her now, waiting for her to falter? As the child quieted, Elizabeth made a decision. She couldn't face this alone. She needed answers, and there was only one person in Ashvale who might have them. The next morning, Elizabeth wrapped the baby in a thick blanket and set out for the edge of town, where an old cottage sat nestled among the trees. It belonged to Maeve Holloway, a reclusive woman the townsfolk referred to as the Keeper Bot. Maeve had lived in Ashvale longer than anyone could remember. Some said she was a healer, others called her a witch. Elizabeth didn't care about the rumors, she cared only about the truth. When she reached the cottage, the door creaked open before she could knock. Maeve stood in the doorway, her piercing gray eyes scanning Elizabeth and the bundle in her arms. "I was wondering when you'd come," Maeve said, her voice like wind through dry leaves. She stepped aside, motioning Elizabeth inside. The interior of the cottage was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dried herbs and wax. Maeve gestured for Elizabeth to sit by the fire, her gaze fixed on the child. "That's no ordinary baby," Maeve said, her tone matter of fact. Elizabeth's grip tightened on the child. "I need to know what it is." "What William did." Maeve crouched by the fire, stirring the embers with a poker. "Your husband made a deal with the kind of forces most people spend their lives pretending don't exist. He wanted power, wealth, control. But there's always a cost." "What kind of cost?" Elizabeth demanded. Maeve's eyes met hers, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw a flicker of something. Pity, perhaps. The child. A bridge, a key, a vessel. Call it what you will, but it's tied to forces older and darker than you can imagine. Elizabeth felt a wave of nausea. "And Midnight, what role does he play?" "Midnight is the gatekeeper," Maeve said. "He carried the offering. He'll carry it again if the balance demands it." The words hung heavy in the air. Elizabeth's mind raced. If what Maeve said was true, then the child wasn't just in danger. It was the danger. That night, Elizabeth returned to the mansion with more questions than answers. Midnight stood in the courtyard, his gaze following her as she climbed the steps. The baby clung to her, its tiny fingers gripping the edge of her dress. Sleep evaded her. The shadows in the mansion seemed to stretch and shift, whispering secrets she couldn't decipher. At midnight, a sound jolted her from her thoughts. The faint, rhythmic drumming of hooves on cobblestone. She looked out the window and saw Midnight, standing at the edge of the forest. The horse's head tilted, as if beckoning her to follow. Against her better judgment, Elizabeth wrapped the baby tightly and stepped into the night. The air was crisp, the moonlight casting long shadows across the ground. Midnight turned and disappeared into the trees. Elizabeth followed, her heart pounding with every step. The forest was unnaturally quiet, the usual sounds of nocturnal life conspicuously absent. The path twisted and turned, the trees seeming to close in around her. Finally, she emerged into a clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, worn with age and etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and twist under the moonlight. Midnight stood beside it, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Elizabeth's breath caught as she approached. The baby stirred in her arms, its crimson eyes reflecting the eerie light of the altar. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "What am I supposed to do?" The air grew heavy, and a voice, not her own, echoed in her mind. "Choose." But Elizabeth fell to her knees, clutching the child as tears streamed down her face. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "What am I supposed to choose?" The voice was relentless. "Whose?" She looked at Midnight, then at the altar. Was she meant to offer the child, to end whatever curse William had brought upon them? The thought made her stomach turn, but a darker part of her whispered that it might be the only way to protect herself, to protect Ashvale. But as she looked down at the baby, its tiny fingers reaching for her face, something inside her shifted. She couldn't do it. Whatever this child was, it wasn't its fault. It hadn't asked to be born into this nightmare. "I won't," she said aloud, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't sacrifice this child." The clearing seemed to sigh, the air growing colder. Midnight reared, his hooves striking the ground with a force that made the earth tremble. Elizabeth held the child close, her resolve unshaken. As dawn broke, Elizabeth found herself back at the mansion, though she had no memory of the walk home. Midnight was gone, and the forest was silent once more. She sat by the fire, the baby asleep in her arms. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't let the forces that had claimed William take the child, no matter the cost. From that day forward, Elizabeth began preparing. She read every book in William's library, consulted Meave, and fortified the mansion against whatever might come. Midnight continued to watch from the shadows, his role unclear but his presence constant. The child, whom Elizabeth named Elias, grew stronger with each passing day. His crimson eyes softened, their glow dimming, though they never entirely faded. Whatever he was hers now, and she would fight to protect him, against the world, against the shadows, and against the unknown. Weeks turned into months, and Elizabeth transformed from a grieving widow into a fierce guardian. The once pristine Renshaw mansion became a fortress. The windows were boarded, the doors reinforced, and symbols Maeve had given her, ancient runes of protection, were etched into every threshold. Elias, as Elizabeth had named the child, grew quickly, his otherworldly energy both a source of wonder and fear. His crimson eyes dimmed but never disappeared entirely, a constant reminder of the forces that had brought him into this world. But peace was fleeting. Midnight's presence became more erratic, his appearances signaling the approach of something darker. The air grew heavy with anticipation, and Elizabeth felt it in her bones. The debt William had incurred was coming to collect. One stormy night, the sky above Ashvale roared with thunder, the rain pounding against the mansion like fists demanding entry. Elizabeth stood at the nursery window, Elias asleep in a cradle nearby. Midnight stood in the courtyard, his dark figure barely visible through the sheets of rain. Then, the knocking began. It wasn't the hesitant knock of a visitor, but a pounding so forceful it rattled the heavy doors. Elizabeth's breath caught as she grabbed the iron poker from the fireplace and crept toward the foyer. "Elizabeth," a voice called from beyond the door, muffled but unmistakable. "Gideon." She hesitated, her grip tightening on the poker. "What do you want?" "I'm here to help," Gideon replied. "They're coming." You can't face this alone." Before she could respond, the wind howled, and the front doors flew open with a deafening crash. Gideon stumbled inside, soaked to the bone. Behind him, the storm seemed to twist unnaturally, the rain swirling in impossible patterns. Shadows danced in the lightning, figures forming and dissipating with each flash. "They're here," Gideon said, his voice grim. The mansion's interior seemed to tremble as the shadows pressed against its walls. Elizabeth and Gideon rushed to the nursery, where Elias was now awake, his cries echoing with an eerie resonance. "Do you want the child?" Gideon said, drawing a dagger from his coat. The blade shimmered, its edge etched with runes that glowed faintly in the dim light. "But they can't have him." Elizabeth's heart raced. "What are they? What do they want with him?" "Call them demons, spirits, or something older," Gideon replied, his gaze fixed on the door as it shuddered under an invisible force. "Your husband promised them a vessel. The child isn't just human. He's a bridge between their world and ours." Elizabeth held Elias close, her voice shaking. "Then why are you here? Why help us?" Gideon glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I know what happens if they succeed." The door burst open, and the shadows poured in. They moved like smoke, twisting and writhing, their forms shifting between humanoid shapes and monstrous figures. Midnight let out a piercing neigh from outside, his cry reverberating through the mansion. As the shadows closed in, Midnight appeared at the nursery window, his hooves striking the ground with earth-shaking force. His eyes glowed, his mane whipping in the wind as though he were a creature of the storm itself. "He's fighting them," Gideon said, his voice filled with awe. "The gatekeeper is buying us time." Elizabeth's mind raced. The symbols Maeve had taught her, the runes William had left behind. There had to be a way to end this. She placed Elias in his cradle and began drawing the protective sigils on the floor, her hands steady despite the chaos around her. "Hold them off," she shouted to Gideon. Gideon lunged at the shadows, his dagger slicing through the darkness. The creatures recoiled, their howls filling the room as they retreated, only to regroup and surge forward again. As Elizabeth completed the final symbol, the room grew unnaturally still. The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering like dying flames. Midnight reared outside, his cry echoing as if in approval. But the voice returned, the one Elizabeth had heard in the forest. "Shoes." She froze, the weight of the command pressing down on her. "What choice?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I've done everything to protect him." The voice was unrelenting. "The bridge cannot remain. Choose the child or the balance." Elizabeth looked at Elias, his crimson eyes gazing back at her with an innocence that tore at her heart. He was a part of her now, a child she had come to love despite everything. But the voice was clear. His existence threatened the fragile barrier between worlds. Tears streamed down her face as she knelt by the cradle. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." She placed a hand on Elias's chest, her other hand gripping the pendant Maeve had given her, a talisman of protection and sacrifice. The sigils around her began to glow, the light intensifying as she recited the words Maeve had taught her. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into the air as the sigils erupted in a blinding flash. Midnight let out one final cry, his silhouette disappearing into the storm. When the light faded, the mansion was silent. Elizabeth lay on the floor, her strength drained. The sigils were burned into the wood, faint wisps of smoke rising from their edges. She crawled to the cradle, her heart pounding in her chest. But when she looked inside, it was empty. "Elias," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The storm outside had calmed, the wind now a gentle breeze. Midnight was gone, the courtyard empty. Elizabeth staggered to her feet, her body trembling as she searched the mansion, calling out for the child. But there was no trace of him. Days turned into weeks, and the mansion grew quiet once more. Elizabeth rarely left, her days consumed by grief and unanswered questions. Maeve visited often, her presence a small comfort, though neither woman spoke of what had happened. One morning, as Elizabeth walked through the garden, she heard a sound, a faint neigh. She turned toward the forest and saw a figure in the distant midnight, standing at the edge of the trees. On his back sat a boy, his crimson eyes now a soft amber, his face calm and serene. "Elias," Elizabeth called, her voice breaking. The boy smiled, a hand raised in farewell, before midnight turned and disappeared into the woods. Elizabeth fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know where they had gone, but she knew one thing: Elias was safe. The debt had been paid, and the balance restored.